Hello, John.
Hey, George.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good.
Um, yeah, I'm on summer break, and I just came back from a trip that was really a lot of fun. That was
Yeah,
kind of sciencey.
I
So
saw I saw a couple of oblique mentions on Twitter.
yeah, well, it was this. I had heard about these literary festivals in England before,
Hmm.
and I've always wanted to be invited to one of these, and
Hmm.
I finally did. And it's a festival that's held in Hay-on-Wye, which,
All
bo-
right.
yeah, it boasts that. Have you ever been there?
Yeah. Oh, it was not with the Cancer Chronicles, but the 10 Most Beautiful Experiments for part of my UK book tour. God, it was great. Gee, it was like tent city, with all these, thousands of people. I think it was the best audience I've ever had at a reading.
Well, you were probably at the big fancy festival. I was at this little, this new festival that is a competitor to the big one. It's called How the
Oh,
Light Gets In, and it's kind of piggybacking on the other festival, and it's also in Hay-on-Wye, but it's much smaller, and it does not have big celebrities like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and George Johnson. It's got sort of the next tier of people, um, and
oh, that's not true. But you were in a castle, right?
well, no, there was an old stone church, I think.
Oh.
So some of the events were it was much more concentrated, much smaller than I think your festival was. We just kind of got intimations of the other big festival off beyond the boundaries of Hay-on-Wye.
Hmm.
But it's called a Philosophy and Music Festival, and
Oh, that sounds great.
it's got this weird title, How the Light Gets In, which I have learned is from a Leonard Cohen song that goes.
Mm.
There's a line in it saying, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in,"
Ooh.
which is a great
Yeah.
line.
Yes, that sounds like it's probably profound.
Yeah. So anyway, it turned out to be so much fun. I really wasn't sure what to expect.
Hmm.
Um, they put us up in this really bizarre mansion about 15 or 20 minutes from the festival. This old uh, this old British estate that was filled with every imaginable kind of junk in this kind of put together in this kind of crazy psychedelic way. Uh, and there are a whole bunch of other speakers there, including a few physicists I'd run into before and some I knew by reputation. So George Ellis, who's the
All right.
yeah, this great
From
South
South
African,
Africa.
yeah,
Yeah.
cosmologist and Quaker,
Hmm.
one of the winners of the Templeton Prize.
All
A
right.
guy named Carlo Rovelli,
Oh,
who
yeah.
I think I interviewed more than 20 years ago. We were sort of we were both pretty sure that we had met before, and I
Mm.
realized that we'd had a telephone conversation when
Oh,
I was writing about loop space theory for Scientific American.
right. Yeah,
Loop
the
space,
gravity. What is it called?
loop space theory, which is it's a
Y-
quantum gravity theory. It's
yeah, it's Lee Smolin was working on that with Ravelli, right?
that
Loop quantum gravity.
loop quantum gravity. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and which is kind of the only problem with loop quantum gravity. My understanding is that it's a theory of everything. If everything counts as gravity, and you don't worry about electromagnetism and the strong and weak nuclear forces.
Oh, okay.
Uh, but
But
he's
yeah,
a
but
really
Lee
interesting.
was. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go on.
Well, so he was there. There was this guy named Carlos Frank,
Hmm.
who I actually met when I was at this Nobel Symposium in Sweden on the birth of the universe back in 1990. I think I mentioned it the last time we
Oh, right.
spoke. That's where I also met Andre Linde. So I go downstairs from this bedroom that Valerie and I were staying in, and walk into this huge room where there's a table must have been 30 feet long, and there are all these people sitting at it, and there's this big guy sitting at the end of the table, and he spots me, and he's kind of looking at me suspiciously, and I said, "I'm John Horgan," and he goes, "Oh, John Horgan, you are the man who called me a barrel-chested man with a Mexican accent and Scientific American." And I'm kind of looking at him like, what the hell?
Well,
so anyway, that's that's how I described him in the lead of this article I wrote on this Nobel Symposium for Scientific American back in 1990. And he said that that phrase has haunted him ever since, and people have made fun of him and kidded him about it. And then, of course, I was worried that Mexican accent had been inaccurate or something, and it turned out, fortunately for me, that he actually was raised in Mexico, and that's and he does have an accent. Probably the most amazing person I met on this trip, somebody who I really struck up a friendship with, was Rupert Sheldrake.
Rupert Sheldrake was there?
Yes.
Wow.
In fact, he was one of the biggest draws of the conference I was at.
Oh, yeah.
So
he's huge still.
Yeah, he is. And I had met him once very briefly when I was on a book tour in London, and there was this scientific reception. There were a lot of evolutionary psychologists there. I remember John Maynard Smith had just given a talk, and a lot of other evolutionary Darwinian folks were there. And then this sort of tall, thin guy comes up to me and introduced himself as Rupert Sheldrake, and he was. I felt that he was kind of trying to strike up an alliance with me. So just for those who don't know, Rupert Sheldrake is he was trained as a biologist. He was trained at Cambridge. He got his PhD in biology at Cambridge in plant development, plant morphogenesis. You know, how you go from a seed to something as complex as an oak tree, and then he proposed this theory. He thought that our current understanding of how organisms work, especially based just on the double helix and the genetic code, is inadequate.
Right.
And he came up with this idea called morphic resonance, which is kind of the way I almost think of it as like a sort of a more expansive version of the Jungian unconscious, in which everything that happens to any particular organism is somehow transmitted into this ineffable field that pervades the universe and is imparted to all new organisms.
The morphogenetic field, right?
Yeah. So it's a theory that, to be more prosaic, it basically suggests that organisms, humans, but especially other organisms that aren't as affected by their own skeptical, so-called rational thinking, have very powerful telepathic powers and are communicating with each other in all sorts of ways.
So if one person learns something, it propagates through the noosphere, and then everybody knows it, at least on some subliminal level?
Yeah. And,
like there's something about crows in milk bottles, right?
Well, one of the famous examples he used is he said that there are monkeys that have learned, I probably have this wrong, but one of the tasks that I think could be used as an example, monkeys have learned how to wash off food, to get the sand off food by dropping it into water, let's say.
Yeah.
And that I think there's this famous example where monkeys on an island learned how to do that, and then monkey colonies elsewhere in the world suddenly started showing the same kind of behavior.
Spooky.
It's that kind of thing. I remember I've written about, and we have talked about, the Flynn effect, which is this mysterious rise in IQ scores discovered by a psychologist named Flynn that has happened as far back as IQs have been tested back to the early 20th century.
Yeah.
And I remember writing about this and then getting some letters from people saying, this is just more evidence of morphic resonance.
Oh, no. I think there's many more prosaic explanations.
Yeah, actually, the last time I looked into it, it was still pretty mysterious. But,
and it doesn't seem to jive with, of course we shouldn't judge things on personal experience, but do you really have the sense that people in general all over the world are getting smarter?
Well, I would like to think so. And there has been progress in human affairs. I do think humans are capable of learning from experience, I don't know, in the old-fashioned way, let's say, and that's why we have more rights and more freedom now than we did, let's say, 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So here's the weird thing. I'm a pretty hardcore skeptic when it comes to ESP. So Sheldrake, also one of his most successful books, was about how pets know when their owners are coming home. And he has done these tests suggesting that it's not just because they remember when their owners are coming home, or they have acute hearing and they know when the car is pulled into the parking lot and that sort of thing. He says that the pets are psychically can sense the owners approaching, and he's done all these experiments to try to prove this. And if I'm reading about this, I just think it's total bullshit. But Sheldrake is so smart, and also I have to admit, it's just because he's so likable. He's this really kind of sweet, gentle person. Plus, he has that fantastic training from Cambridge, so he really knows how to present his ideas in a way that makes them, at least in this encounter I had with him, very hard to just sort of wave away.
Yeah.
And
even though he's remained totally on the fringe as far as science, but he has a huge following. But it's more kind of the New Age kind of thing, isn't it?
Yes, I would say that's true, and he has been viciously attacked by mainstream scientists and the sort of self-designated skeptics like Mike Shermer. There was a famous after Sheldrake's first book was published in the early 80s, and it presented his morphic resonance theory. John Maddox, the curmudgeonly editor of Nature, wrote an editorial that's now famous, legendary, proposing that he basically said, if it's appropriate to burn any books, Rupert Sheldrake's book would be a really good candidate.
Well, that probably sold another 10,000 copies right there.
It did. It actually was. Sheldrake said it was wonderful publicity for his book, but but he still is annoyed. He thinks that he should be taken more seriously, and that he's doing all these experiments and presenting all this evidence, and he's not getting a fair hearing. So anyway, and I have to admit, I was quite sympathetic toward him, and I guess my attitude was comes in part from my feeling that there is so much so-called mainstream science today that is quite beyond the pale in terms of its testability, its evidence. So anyway, I told Rupert that I'm going to do a Q&A with him for Scientific American.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, and let him present his theories to Scientific American readership.
So you're kind of saying that, if we have physicists entertaining like 10-dimensional space and a landscape of multiverse, of different universes, a multiverse of the landscape of universes, then why not the morphogenetic field?
Exactly.
That would be very interesting to present that question to Ed Witten, or one of the superstring theorists.
Yeah, well, this comparison was very much in my mind and hand. Why? Because there were all these physicists there. We ended up talking a lot about string theory, multiverses. George Ellis, for one, I think it's fair to say, is really disturbed at the direction that physics has gone in recently.
Yeah. Multiverse would be real tough for a devout Christian like George Ellis.
Yeah. I don't know if he would agree that it's his Christianity that is his main objection to multiverses.
Oh, well, maybe not his main, but I was just thinking. I mean, I met him a long time ago in Cape Town at this thing called the Parliament of World Religions.
Oh.
And they had a session on science and religion, and he was part of that.
Yeah. And did he say that faith is?
That I can't remember, so I shouldn't speculate beyond the the scraps of faded data in my brain. But I'm just wondering, it's just kind of interesting, the whole extraterrestrial problem that some devout Christians have discussed.
Yeah, I think.
And it seems like if that's a problem, the multiverses would really,
Hey, listen, it doesn't even have to be multiverses. It could just be exoplanets,
Well, yeah. I think intelligent life is the real stickler there.
So I seem to recall that Teilhard de Chardin, the great Jesuit astronomer or biologist, scientist, let's call him.
Yeah.
He thought a lot about the question of whether Jesus just died for our sins or also died for the sins of all sentient creatures throughout the universe.
Right.
And I think he concluded that Jesus died even for E.T.'s sins.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, he was the now Chardin's his alpha, no, his omega point, he called it, right?
That's right.
In this kind of teleological view of evolution and something called the noosphere, which was like this atmosphere of thought. So it sounds like that's kind of, I wonder how that compares with the morphogenetic field of Rupert Sheldrake.
Yeah, the way that I understood the noosphere, I think, so Bob Wright has written about that concept, as I recall, and has related it to the kind of cosmic group mind that is emerging on the Earth now as a result of the internet, as a result of all these powerful technologies that are helping us connect with each other.
Yeah,
so that's how I understood the noosphere. Although I'm sure there could be a mystical component. Here's the thing: if Rupert Sheldrake was here, he could give us a little, a wonderfully articulate little mini essay on the overlap or divergence between morphic resonance and the noosphere.
And superstring theory.
And superstring.
God, that'd be great.
You're right. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that was.
Well, he sounds real. Yeah, I'd kind of like to meet him. He sounds like he'd be an interesting conversational companion.
He is, and he knows some of the people that I interviewed for my my rational mysticism book. So
Oh, yeah.
he ended up being a very good friend of this guy named Terence McKenna, who was this sort of wild, psychedelic performance artist scholar who gave lectures and wrote books with these very wild but very entertaining theories of everything. He predicted that the shit was going to hit the fan in December 2012 and helped to popularize that meme. Which of course turned out not to have happened. But,
yeah, at least no more of that day than any other day.
That's right. Every day is amazing.
Every day. Yeah.
Every day is an apocalypse. So that was fun. And then I participated in a couple of debates, one about physics. And, it was called Dreams of the Universe. So the question we were supposed to wrestle with was whether physics has become disconnected from its empirical mooring.
Yeah.
And of course, they asked me to defend that position. And then there were these two young physicists named Tara Shears, who was at CERN, and a British physicist named David Tong. And I guess they were arguing that physics is not in as bad shape as I make it sound. But it was a little disappointing because I was kind of hoping that they would defend strings and multiverses more strenuously.
With some, did they indicate they thought there was some kind of possibility of an empirical test for that?
They thought that it was premature to rule them out entirely, but at various points, I think both Shears and Tong pretty much admitted that string theory could never be confirmed. That is, because it deals with the stuff at the Planck scale, this infinitesimal distance scale that will forever lie beyond the power of our experiments. But then they would kind of say, but, we just keep experimenting and see what happens, and,
it's just a fascinating intellectual frontier.
Yeah.
Even though, there's part of me or a big part of me that thinks that we, or science, is just kind of up against the edge of what our brains can comprehend. But you can't, just take that as a defeatist attitude and not keep pushing. But you have to realize that there's got to be limits to what we can know about the universe, and there's no particular reason why we humans on this planet at this very moment in time should have the intellectual capacity and the ideas and the experience through experiments and everything to have figured out the entire universe. I mean, it's kind of a weird form of the whole Copernican dilemma of thinking that we're at the center of the universe and then everything's skewed through that perspective that humans must be the focus of creation. But why should this one moment in time be the culmination when we can possibly figure out how everything works, including superstring theory?
Yeah, I'm totally sympathetic to that, as you know. On the other hand, though, the optimist would say, look at what we've discovered already.
Amazing.
We have good reason to be confident that we can know it all. Because, my God, look at the Big Bang Theory. Look at quantum mechanics. Look at the Standard Model.
It's amazing.
Evolutionary theory. I didn't meet him this time, but another speaker at this festival was the chemist Peter Atkins.
Oh, yeah.
Who is a really hardcore atheist and scientific reductionist, thinks that science is our only way of knowing things. And he also has this extraordinarily confident view that science will explain everything,
Yeah.
absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And he gave a talk on that at the festival, but I was, I had a conflict, so I couldn't go see it.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to see that if there's a recording. But yeah, I mean, so including why there's something instead of nothing,
Exactly.
like Lawrence Krauss tried to explain in his recent book.
Right. So, and I find that confidence to be bizarre.
Which to me is just unanswerable.
But what the hell? Peter Atkins thinks everything is going to be, all mysteries will be solved by science, and the riddle of the universe will be completely explained. And what I find almost scary about this view is that you can certainly imagine people convincing themselves that they have explained everything. It doesn't mean that they have.
Yeah.
But that they have. I mean, this is what religion used to do. Religion used to be convinced that their particular faith had explained the universe.
Yeah, all-encompassing airtight explanation.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
It doesn't mean it's true.
No, it's easy to delude yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm definitely with him, as far as saying that if anything's going to, any means of knowing, whatever that means, is going to figure everything out, or as much of everything as we can. Of course, it's going to be, an empirical an approach combining empiricism and theory and that feedback back and forth. In other words, science. It's not going to be, mystical contemplation or any kind of religion. And when we were in Cambridge, back at that first Templeton Science and Religion conference, and Richard Dawkins gave one of the first talks and made that point just so powerfully that, maybe science is not going to figure out everything, or maybe he said science has certainly not figured out everything, and there's still big gaps in our knowledge, but that certainly doesn't mean, therefore, religion is better equipped than science to figure them out. I mean, that's absurd.
Yeah, listen, this relates to what, this relates back to Rupert Sheldrake. See, he had read my book, The End of Science, when I first met him in 1997. And he said then, and he reiterated this time, that he said, your book describes the end of a certain kind of science, reductionist and materialist. And he said, I agree. I think that science has exhausted itself, and we need a new, more expansive kind of science that sheds some of that dogma. And then this is where morphic resonance and some of these other ideas come in. And I would agree that if it can be demonstrated that, I don't know, something is that a dog really does have psychic powers. He also had told me this wonderful story about homing pigeons. He thinks that homing pigeons are using telepathy to get back home, that they're communicating.
Yeah, but
yeah,
I mean, the word telepathy, of course, is, just kind of sets off all these alarm bells in my brain. But the thing is, I mean, what does he mean beyond science? Because if this stuff turns out to be empirically verifiable, it'll turn out that there's some sort of signaling, or there's some means by which telepathy occurs, and we'll have a mechanism for it. And
absolutely,
and then it becomes part of science. So it's, if it were, it's not like there's going to be this new science. It would be subsumed as part of science, which is what makes science such a powerful means of inquiry.
Yeah, I think he would agree with that. Yeah, he's not saying it's the end of science as a whole. He thinks it is. Listen, I think you'd agree, if science suddenly starts taking telepathy seriously, that is definitely a new kind of science.
Oh yeah, well, it'd be huge, but they'd take it seriously because it would actually there would actually be experiments that produce more than the mostly random noise that the experiments have so far. So there'd be a reason to believe that it was possibly in effect, and there'd be all this continuing work to rule out other, more mundane explanations. And then finally, if they didn't go away, and meanwhile, looking for some kind of possible mechanism. So, that's just like science, working as usual.
There are interesting kind of parallels to what Sheldrake is saying by people who are not seen as so far beyond the pale.
Mm-hmm.
So what he was saying about science and what needs to happen to it reminded me a lot of this new book, Mind and Cosmos, by, not new, I guess it's about a year old now, by Thomas Nagel, the great philosopher.
Oh, but Nagel was excoriated for for that book in so many quarters.
He was excoriated for it. On the other hand, I think the questions he was raising were perfectly legitimate.
Yeah.
That how can we say that we really have explained the universe when science basically starts with physics, and there is nothing implicit in physics about the emergence of life or the emergence of consciousness. And I think others have raised these sorts of questions too. I think Stu Kaufman is kind of in that territory. John Wheeler is in that territory.
Yeah.
And so Sheldrake is sort of waving his hands and saying, "Hey guys, listen, you're looking for this new paradigm. I got one right over here."
Yeah.
But those people, I don't think they want to have anything to do with Sheldrake for fairly obvious reasons. Just one other example, and it's popped up in Scientific American a lot recently. Christoph Koch, who we both know, the very prominent neuroscientist, he has been pushing this new theory. I don't think you can call it a theory. Panpsychism.
Well, it's related to this guy Tononi, this Italian philosopher, right? And he has this idea of defining consciousness in terms of some metric. Oh, what is it called? It's
information something.
Yeah, integrated information, and I don't know. I mean, I've read some of his stuff and some of the critiques of it, and it doesn't really. It sounds like the same kind of problem with trying to explain consciousness, where you can get something that maybe seems to offer the possibility of some way, in this case, a way to quantify what we think of as consciousness, and yet it doesn't really go as far as giving you that satisfying feeling of saying, oh yes, this is what a conscious experience is. This is that feeling of being alive and sentient in the world. And then you mentioned panpsychism, and then it also implies that consciousness is like this physical quality that exists in different degrees and different beings, including mechanical things such as thermometers and thermostats.
Rocks.
Yeah, but this is no different from what, it's differently expressed, but isn't this what David Chalmers, the philosopher, has been arguing, that there's the reason that we can't figure out consciousness is because we need to admit some new entity along with matter and energy and time and space into the way we carve up the universe, and this would be some kind of little atoms of consciousness.
Sounds kind of like the morphogenic field to me, George.
Yeah, but this stuff again is not really. I wouldn't say this is, being entertained, with any enthusiasm by mainstream neuroscience. This is mostly philosophers.
But the weird thing is that Christoph is, he's intimately involved in the big Allen Brain Project and the new federally funded Brain Initiative. Yeah. And so to me, I'm with you. I actually see the fact that somebody that prominent is entertaining something that seems actually quite new age to me, even though, as you say, there are precedents for Chalmers and even John Wheeler was kind of in that
Yeah.
ballpark. To me, that's a symptom of desperation.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, it does, I'm not. I'm not unsympathetic to the idea that there really could be some basic entity to the to reality that we're missing that would explain consciousness. But for that to become part of science, and it would have to be something that's quantifiable, and that's, I guess, what Tononi is trying to do. But with this is integrated information, so it would become something. It would have to become something that you can measure, and not just a lot of new agey hand waving. And I'm sure that's something you can measure, and is what Christoph Koch is attracted to, because he's like kind of the opposite of a hand wavy new ager. He's a very, 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 very hard-minded scientist. So
the funny thing was, I saw an encounter. I described this in, I think, The End of Science. I saw an encounter between Christoph and David Chalmers at that first consciousness meeting in Tucson. I think it was 94 or so, and it was at a reception. Everybody was drinking after all the lectures were over during the day, and people were standing around shooting the shit. And David Chalmers had earlier in that day just given his first lecture on consciousness being the hard problem. And then had a little bit of his information theory of consciousness at the end, and Christoph spotted him and strode over to him, and I happened to be right there. And Christoph starts yelling at him and saying that Chalmers' information theory of consciousness was total bullshit. He compared it to saying that the Holy Ghost comes down and goes into your head. So he made it sound like religious nonsense, and yet that's basically what he's espousing now. So now he, in Scientific American, he seems to be claiming that it's very testable and it can be rigorously defined and so forth. But I don't know.
But again, it would be a way to explain consciousness in terms of things that we really already accept as part of the physical world. In information, and whether you think information is fundamental, or if it's something that derives from mass, energy, space, time. Still that's it's accepted that you can measure information and amounts of information and different kinds of complexity. So it just doesn't seem to me that this is radically different than the different ways there are to measure, like, mutual information in a system, or the old Shannon stuff. It's just a way of looking at a way to put a metric that would seem to correlate with a system that has different degrees of what we call consciousness. But
I've always found something sort of weirdly tautological about using information to define consciousness or to really explain anything. To me, the concept of information only makes sense if you've got not only an observer, but an actor in the system. Information is something that you and I get, and then we change our minds and we do something differently in the future. It's something that's physical, and yet it changes our view of things and sets us off on a different trajectory.
See, I don't think information has to do that to be information.
Without an observer or actor, information is just kind of another term for strictly physical processes.
But what is? But it's like what? It's 1 or 0. It's like the minimum kind of distinction. Something is here or there. So this tiny little subatomic particle is in this particular position 1, or it's not 0. And I don't know. I could imagine a way where you could just kind of carve up everything, taking that as fundamental, and then having mass energy arise from that. I think that's that's what some people talk about when they're talking about admitting information into as one of the real, like, bottom entities the bedrock core concepts of the universe, in which case maybe somehow you get consciousness out of that. But, this is all so far beyond any kind of demonstrable science or testable.
Yeah. I mean,
it's so interesting, though.
I'm such a hardcore reductionist that I think if, let's say, an asteroid...
but this is hardcore reductionism, though.
Well, okay, this goes back to the idea of panpsychism or morphic or whatever.
Yeah, but
so here's I would love to believe that consciousness is somehow as intrinsic to reality, as fundamental, as primal, as matter and energy. But
like that they're psychons.
The hard-nosed part of me thinks that if an asteroid destroys all life on Earth tomorrow, as far as we know, since we have no life has been discovered elsewhere, it's quite possible that this universe will become completely unconscious, and there will be no information in that universe. Once there are no more conscious beings, it will be a strictly physical, mechanical thing. It'll go trundling on forever. But
I think you're probably right. I mean, I find it fascinating to think that there's some basic entity that we have not yet discovered that would make some of these intractable problems suddenly become clear. But, it's one thing to kind of be fascinated by that and think that it's going to happen. And I've always really been attracted by Stephen Jay Gould's idea in his book, Wonderful Life, that if you rewound the tape of evolution, rewound history back to Precambrian times, before the great efflorescence of different kinds of animal life with the so-called Cambrian explosion, that if things had gone a little differently, like if some little, one of the little creatures had been, squished by a rock or something, that we wouldn't have evolved along this line, and there wouldn't be anything like us, or there would not be anything like a conscious being. And, of course, there's all these arguments that evolution, as it produces systems that are more and more adapted, and sometimes that means systems that are more and more complex, is naturally going to converge on intelligence and consciousness. But, I kind of like the idea of it being just a complete fluke.
Our narcissism is so powerful. It's automatic. For most of us, I think it's automatic and unconscious. So part of me agrees with that and accepts rationally that we are here. We're just flukes, and that you can have an infinite number of iterations of this universe, and nothing like us came into being. But the idea that there is something special about us, that we have a destiny, that we were meant to be here, it's sort of rooted in a different part of me.
It's basic.
Yeah, it's really pretty. We're all narcissists about ourselves as individuals, and we're narcissists about our species.
Well, and it drives, it has driven all of the old, teleological explanations that, are pretty much discarded by serious science, including Teilhard de Chardin and the idea that we're converging and evolving towards some, higher point, and that it's natural that we humans would have evolved. That's really the Catholic Church's, even though it, talks about accepting evolution, that's really how it sees it theologically. We were meant to be by the great meaner, and maybe the means was through evolution, which isn't really a very scientific way to look at it. But it's also what drives this whole thing with looking at multiverses and the idea that, we have to explain why we're here, and it can't just be this fluke and a bunch of random glitches. The human brain just recoils against randomness, and sometimes I don't understand that. To me, it just seems perfectly not satisfying, but I'm happy enough to just think that, wow, all these things in the universe unfolded in just a certain way, and the the cosmological constant is this, and the charge of the electron is that, and alpha, the great, the quantity that combines three of these parameters. If it were slightly different, there wouldn't be life. I mean, to me, it's just like, well, yeah, it's really cool that it happened, and then here we are marveling about it. But it doesn't seem like, we really need to feel compelled to say this had to happen. And if we can't show that it had to happen in this universe, that we invent 10 to the 500, parallel universes to say, I just don't see where that gets you. But
Right. Yeah, I don't either. Hey, I think I'm going to bring up something else that happened at the conference because I think it's related to what we've been talking about and to what we've talked about in the past. I participated in a session, debate, whatever, on big data, and the title was The End of Theory. So I thought that was a reference to the Chris Anderson essay in Wired in 2008 when he said that he didn't actually use the phrase big data, but that's basically what he was talking about, that powerful digital technologies plus these enormous databases that are being generated by that are enabled by the internet are making possible, again, a new kind of science, but a science that doesn't have to bother with understanding.
Yeah, just correlating.
Theory construction. Yeah, correlations, not causations. So there's a book that became a bestseller written by the data editor for The Economist, this guy named Ken Cukier, and an Oxford professor named Schoenberger, that made this case. It sounded like kind of an expanded version of Chris Anderson's argument for a science of correlation rather than causation, and so Cukier was part of this session. He was defending that thesis, the end of theory, and saying that big data is going to do all these fantastic things, and he kind of, in response to criticism from me and he got some really harsh criticism from a couple of physicists in the audience, including Carlos Frank, who were strongly defending the need for theory. Cukier, almost at the end, seemed to be saying that computers could do all the science without having any need for, be humans getting in the way.
Well, that's no fun, but I mean, an example, this all sounds so abstract, but an example is how Google has made so much progress in solving the language translation problem.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the intractable problems in science, and for years, people in artificial intelligence have come up with all these theories of language and ways to put all these little modules and agents together in these AI programs to translate from one language to another, and mostly it's just showed how almost impossible the problem is. So instead of trying to understand it, Google basically takes a bunch of texts and say Chinese, and then it takes the same text that a human in the past has translated into English, and then it finds statistical correlations. And they go into, I don't know what they use, maybe some kind of big artificial neural network. And so these become embodied, these correlations, and then you can feed new texts, and based on these correlations, it will give you, some pretty decent translations, but you don't really understand what the machine's doing, and you can't really point there and saying, oh, here's this rule that it figured out, and here's this exception to the rule. It's all just correlations. So basically, you could invent one of these things and train it, and then you would still have to have theories about how it worked. Just like now we have scientists dissecting brains and testing electrical signals from brains and coming up with theories of how the brain works. So you'd have to have competing theories of how this thing that we built works, which is just a mind-blowing idea.
Yeah, I started, before this session, I started thinking about this end of theory idea, and it reminded me of a couple of things. One was my understanding of logical positivism. This theory that was popular in the early 20th century.
Yeah,
was that it
Carnap
was
and the Vienna.
yeah,
People,
which
yeah.
it was basically trying to get us away from metaphysics
Yeah.
and saying that just stick to the data. Don't try even too hard to comprehend them with your puny little human mind, because then you are probably going to impose your folk wisdom on the data and
Yeah.
come up with some totally bullshit explanation.
Right.
I think this was especially popular as an application to quantum mechanics.
Mhm.
So, quantum people were trying to make sense of, Einstein and others were trying to make sense of quantum mechanics. And I think some of the logical positivists, and I think Niels Bohr was attracted to logical positivism, were saying, listen, the world is what it is.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and it's going to resist our understanding, and that's just tough shit. You
Yeah.
just have to accept that.
Yeah. It's beyond
but-
what our brains maybe can understand, so.
Yeah, but but then there's another part of me. We absolutely need theory,
Yeah.
especially as we get more data,
Yeah.
because otherwise we're going to drown in it. I mean, the data, there's a virtually infinite.
Wait, you're gone again.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh.
at this point, especially, there really is infinite data. So then, how do you select? How do you decide which data are important?
Yeah. Well, with the example of Google Translation, it just kind of comes out in the wash, right? Because
That's right.
You trains it and works, and you don't exactly know how it works. But I mean, I don't think there ever would be an end of theory, because I think people are then going to theorize about how something like that works, and it maybe gives insights into the brain. It's kind of like that. That science fiction. Well, I don't. You probably would resist the term science fiction, but that novel. Galatia 2.0 that Thomas Powers wrote about an artificial intelligence.
I think his name is Richard
Powers.
I love that book.
Yeah. And I mean, there you basically have an artificial intelligence that has been invented and using some kind of neural networks that are trained by feeding it books and things. So it develops this personality, this intelligence, seemingly this consciousness. Through this training, really through the same kind of statistical sort of techniques, and yet its makers don't really know quite how it works. And and then they interrogate it and study it, just like you'd study a creature that developed through evolution.
Yeah, I remember interviewing the Deep Blue guys. That this was the team of IBM engineers who created a chess playing computer program that ran on an IBM supercomputer that I think at one point was the most powerful in the world.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a big data computer. It had some chess rules in it, but basically it was a brute force method of examining hundreds of millions of moves a second, I think.
Yeah.
And I said, what's do you really understand this program? And they were saying that the computer would choose different moves. So if you presented it with the same chess positions, it would sometimes choose one move. It would sometimes choose another move for reasons that they didn't really understand. It was that complex, which is
so it was it was more than just a lot of heuristic rules and searching the tree of moves and counter moves and.
Right. And and you could say that sort of unpredictability is one of the hallmarks of, I don't know, certainly of humans, maybe of consciousness.
In
general.
I mean, you can imagine, the computer if the computer is able to develop a model through, some kind of statistical correlations of its opponent, there would be, and then when it starts searching the tree of future possible moves and counter moves, that the game might proceed by, it would, be, some would be weighted more strongly than others because, the computer had sort of learned, quote unquote, this was more likely the approach that its opponent would take.
Right.
Yeah, wow.
By the way, you know that you probably know. For some reason, I got into a conversation with somebody about Deep Blue and chess playing programs now. There are programs you can run on your smartphone now that will beat anybody, any human.
Yeah.
That's big data.
Yeah, it's not led to us understanding the human mind anymore and how good chess masters think. It's yeah.
And as I wrote a column spelling out some of my reservations about big data, and and saying that in principle, this correlation motivated style of science could be very powerful. And I actually brought up as an example the correlation of smoking to lung cancer.
Oh, yeah.
A huge difference in public health. But those sorts of examples are somewhat isolated still. And if you look at medicine, since the revolution in genetics and biotechnology and computational medicine and so forth, it's not like there has been progress in treating people that is in any way proportional to the progress in digital technology.
No.
It just hasn't happened.
Yeah.
You know what the story is with cancer, with genetic medicine. That's really been a disappointment so far. And in behavioral genetics, some aspects of genetics, you're getting this terrible phenomenon of too many correlations being pointed out. It's kind of like the cancer cluster phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the problem is, the more data you have, the more potential correlations there are, whether you're looking for a connection between two data points or a cluster of connections between 3 or 4, you quickly get an exponential explosion of possible connections, and only a tiny fraction of those will be meaningful.
Right. So then you still need some kind of theory.
Yeah.
I would think.
Or feedback.
To try to distinguish false positives from true positives.
Yeah.
To discover which correlations are really strong. Some correlations just jump out at you. That was the nature of the smoking cancer correlation, but others are much more subtle.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to compare. Yeah. Excuse me, this big data question to epidemiology as you do in your column, because generally, if you find a correlation, it's a hint that maybe there's a mechanism there. Right. And then you look for the mechanism. And with smoking, the correlation was so strong. It's like 20, a multiplier of 20 as far as heavy smokers and likelihood for lifetime chance of getting lung cancer. And there's just been really nothing. There's been no correlations found in cancer epidemiology, I think it's fair to say, that come close to that. Even the correlation between ionizing radiation and cancer.
Yeah.
Of course, it depends on the measurement of the blast you're getting and all of that. But that was a rare thing to get, a signal like 20 to 1. And then it's also the other thing that made it so strong was just the plausibility of the possibility that, hey, maybe smoking, this whole witch's brew of heated, long chain carbon molecules of, millions of random different varieties into your lungs multiple times a day for decades is going to cause some kind of lung cancer. It just seems plausible. But then you get these other signals and they're just so tiny, it's just really, they're just slightly observable above the noise, kind of like with most of the correlations between individual foods and likelihood of getting or not getting cancer.
Yeah, and another objection I have to this sort of vision of science is that it's really focused on power as the outcome of science. Power meaning our ability to predict and manipulate the world and to get certain outcomes and develop new technologies that make our lives more comfortable and make us live longer and so forth. And I obviously that's an extremely important part of science, but the part that lured me into it is the understanding part.
Well, yeah, but I think that's what drives most scientists, and and that's why it seems to me that big data is just, I mean, it's just wonderful tool, but then it's easy to confuse it with with being this be all end all new approach to science, when actually it's just going to provide more possibilities to be explored in a more analytical way. But sometimes there's going to be things that we just won't be able to explain. But I think
Yeah.
people will still try to theorize about why the system is what's going on inside there when it's translating a document, or if our maybe we'll understand consciousness. The closest we'll get is by developing a machine like the one in the Richard Powers novel, and it will start seeming conscious, and people will argue about whether it's conscious or not, and slowly more and more people will be convinced that it is, and they still won't know how it works, and then they'll theorize about it, and maybe forever.
Well, I remember Marvin Minsky once wrote, I think this was in his book, Societies of Mind. Marvin Minsky, of course, the pioneer of artificial intelligence, that he was talking about the singularity many decades ago.
Yeah.
Although he didn't use that term, that computers were going to become autonomous and super intelligent. So
Yeah.
he thought that they would be just as baffled by the question of consciousness and the mind-body problem and free will as we are, and that they would be in this kind of arms race with themselves as they tried to understand themselves and became smarter to do so. Then they become more complex and they can never quite catch up.
Yeah.
Limits of science, man. Limits of science.
Yeah, and then they would come up with this theory that they were just a simulation running on somebody else's computer system.
Hey, we're over an hour.
You're right. Yes, so this would be a good time to wrap up.
Yeah. Anyway, I will. I'll tell Bogging Heads about the little glitch that I had.
Oh yeah, and then they can splice it back together. But yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess did we say something before all this that they can end on?
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, let's just give them something in case they want to use it, and cut this last few seconds out. But
Okay.
So big data.
Yeah. Let's see. Maybe
Yeah.
this time, computers really will create a new kind of science. Maybe it'll be big data proving the existence of morphic resonance.
And consciousness, and but there's going to be people there just trying to figure out how they work. So
Right.
anyway, something to mull over until we meet again.
Okay. Sounds good, George.
Okay, see you
Take it
soon.
easy.